look, AI is still being trained by us, right? So the fact that it's able to kind of detect certain things earlier is only because of the hard scientific work and medical work that has come before it. Not saying that it can't do new stuff, right? Not saying that it can't, possibly find new detections for things. One of my favorite things that I just learned about, man, I wish I could remember the name of the disease, but it's a degenerative disease like Parkinson's or, um, you
One of
know,
your favorite things you learned about is a degenerative disease. Please continue.
hold on.
I know.
There's more to it. So this nurse who worked with a lot of Parkinson's patients or a lot of people who had this disease, I can't remember the name of it. She went to a conference with a bunch of doctors, and they were talking about new treatments and new detection. And she raised her hand during one of the Q&As, and she was like, "Hey, why do they all have kind of this like very specific smell that's coming off their body? It's not unpleasant, but it's just a specific smell."
Yeah, I read about this too.
Yeah, and they were like, "We don't," but there was as a good
What
scientist
smell?
would, I've never heard of that, and he went back and did some research and found out that there was no such thing, and kind of just wrote it off until he kind of they were able he was able to get the money via marketing to try to run a trial and see if this woman could detect these smells. She ended up being 100% precise with they gave her like swabs of sweat from people with the disease, without the disease.
Her
She was able
name's
to detect
Joy
it with
Milne.
100% accuracy. From that, they were able to distill, sweat from sweat glands of people who had the disease and find these markers, find these chemicals that were coming off these folks who had this disease. And she actually was able to identify the disease before it had manifested within somebody. And so now there's early tests for things like that. That's something
And you're
AI
not
can't
wrong, by
do.
the way, with the degenerative disease, because the reason you had a hard time with it was because she can smell multiple diseases and cancers and has been able to identify markers through the sense.
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing, right? And that's a human trait, not saying that we can't train a AI to smell. There are definitely, sensors and receptors and electronic sensors and receptors for smell and whatnot, but that's kind of like that's very futuristic down the road. But the ingenuity and the kind of the notice of the pattern finding, the noticing of patterns with things, and again, not something that AI necessarily can't do, but that's a very specific human thing that happened there with that early detection, that capability. One of the things with COVID, when it first came out, there was an AI that was monitoring, sicknesses around the world, and it was actually able to. It was like, hey, something's going on in China. Like, I think months before China had ever said, like, oh yeah, we got something going on here. There's a new sickness going around. There was an AI that, like, just with like news articles and noticing like patterns, like it was able to say, I think there's like a
Something's
pandemic.
up in the 100-acre wood
Yeah, there's a pandemic in China, or not pandemic in China, but there's some kind of
in
a
event.
sickness going around in China that hasn't been identified yet. And so yeah, there's tools, and it's great to have these things because as humans, like, we can't do the number of calculations that these things can do, that these can do, right? Which is great. I did have a buddy early on kind of talk to me about AI, and he was like, but it'll find things that you can't find. Like, it'll notice patterns that you won't notice. And I'm
It
like,
will.
good, but, correlation is not always causation. There's a lot more that kind of goes into everything than just like finding patterns. So that's where the specifically human traits I feel like come in. So I do feel like AI as, as a diagnostic tool, great. As long as we still have humans behind it who are training it, who are updating it with the most up-to-date information and working together with it, right? That's another big thing I think that, we kind of take for granted with AI, is that it is a tool for our toolbox that we use, and I feel like we need to work we need to work more together with it as a pair. And again, it's force multiplier. I think we've said that term several times while talking about AI.